Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. It might seem extreme to use a microphone, but we're recording this for the website too. So if you miss anything or have to run out for a few minutes, you can go to the website and look it all up again at techmuseum.org. I'm Angie Corio, and I host In Deep Radio and live from the left coast. And before we get started, if you have a cell phone on or anything that's going to beep or bang or be intrusive, can you turn it off? And if you need to leave early, if you can kind of head out the back way, people coming and going, we're going to have some late arrivers too. So if you get a chance to leave, if you want to go out the back door, if we're not quite finished, it's a little less disruptive. You will find some paper at your chair, and that's for any of your questions that you might have. And if you have, at any point in the interview, if you want to contribute a question or a thought, just write it down, hold it up. Leslie will get that and will come by magic to me up here, and we'll integrate that into the discussion. Couple talks coming up that are interesting. August 26th, same time, same place. I guess I say same bat channel, right? William J. Clancy, who's chief scientist of the Human-Centered Computing Intelligence Systems Division at NASA Ames Research Center. He'll be here to talk about voyages of scientific discovery with the Mars exploration rovers. And coming up on September 16th, this one's really cool. I love the thought of this. We're going to talk about the physics of animation. Professor Alejandro Garcia is going to be here, and he actually has taken leave from his work to be a physics consultant on Madagascar 3. So a topic, I don't know about you, but I never even thought about the physics of animation, and that's going to be pretty interesting. That and all of our talks are on thetech.org. And we're always welcoming your new ideas about who we could talk to that you would find interesting. So please feel free to submit those too. I'm here, Leslie's here, wandering about, so we're glad to talk to you about that. Bruce Scivally is our guest today, the large head in the corner of the room. And, he's a historian who teaches classes in script writing, film history, theory, and pre-production at the Illinois Institute of Art, Chicago, and Columbia College. His latest book is Billion Dollar Batman, a comprehensive history of the Dark Knight from 10-cent comic book to global icon. He is also global editor of the Special Effects and Stunts Guide and co-author of James Bond, The Legacy. And that was featured in TV shows, highlighted in magazines from Glamour to Playboy. He's previously a documentary producer, a director, and a writer. And his credits include special edition DVD releases of the James Bond films, Legally Blonde, A Fish Called Wanda, and a lot of others. So please welcome Bruce Scivally.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you here, and I'm glad you could make time.
It's great to be here.
Well, let's talk about the very beginnings of Batman. And he was created by Bob Kane and the writer Bill Finger in 1939. And I want to throw out some of the others that were around in about the same era. Captain Marvel, the DC Comics version, came out in 1939. And Kate Tsar came out in 1936. And Doc Strange in 1940. And Phantom Eagle in 1942. And nobody's ever heard of them. So why are we... Well, you have. You're
Well,
the
I was going to
comics
say
guy.
Captain Marvel, if it's the one I'm thinking of. That was actually Fawcett Publications, and that was kind of a knockoff of Superman, which had come out in 1938. But
why are we still talking about Batman all these years later when these icons of the same age have more or less faded away?
Well, I tried to kind of sum it up in my introduction. And I'd previously written a book on Superman in movies and television. And when I was going around promoting that, everyone kept saying, when are you going to write one on Batman? And I got the feeling that there's actually a lot of folks out there who prefer Batman over Superman. I'm kind of on the fence. I like them both. But I think the reason there are probably more Batman fans than Superman fans is because Superman represents all that's good about us. He represents hope and idealism and goodness. And Batman's a much darker character. He's a character who's based in revenge, who'd seen his parents murdered before his eyes. And he's much more human. He doesn't have any superhero powers. So I say that, Superman's what we aspire to be, but Batman's what we are. And I think that's why it's hung on the way it has.
Did he start out as a Dark Knight? Did he start out as someone with all those, you mentioned, of course, that his parents were murdered before his eyes, and that's integrated into the early part of the series. But did we always see so much of his inner turmoil, or is that something newer?
It's really something newer. In the first year or so, the character was kind of a detective character who dressed up in this outfit, and he was going out and beating up criminals. There were even a few issues in the first year that he was around where he carried a gun, but he very quickly got rid of that. But after the first year, they decided to introduce Robin, and it was in the issue that introduced Robin, or I believe they also told Batman's origin, or actually it was probably like 4 issues in before they told Batman's origin. But once Robin came on the scene, it kind of lightened Batman up, you know. And I think also they were very aware that they were making comic books for little kids, and they wanted to not to make them too dark and too violent. And particularly in the 1950s, when Dr. Frederick Wertham was doing his attacks on comic books, the Batman comics got pretty silly for a while.
You're talking about a guy who's running around in a cape and tights, and they got silly?
They got sillier. You know, I mean, when you have Batman turning into Bat Baby, or Batman and Robin going back to prehistoric times, you know, they had this sort of weird sci-fi element where, you know, he wasn't so much battling criminals so much as he was more of a time-traveling character, in a way, for a while. So, you know, everyone looks back now on the Adam West TV series, and they say, oh, it was so campy, it was so dumb, it was so silly. But that's exactly the way the comic books were through the 50s and early 1960s. It wasn't until just before the TV show hit that they started revamping Batman in the comics.
Well, in fact, you anticipate one of my questions. Most of us here don't have a grasp of what the world of comic books were like when he was first birthed in 1939. So what kind of comic book world did he come into, and how unusual was he?
Well, the comic books were very new at that point. They had actually, you know, the pulp novels were around in the 1930s, Doc Savage, The Shadow, those sort of things. But those were more literary. They're you know, stories told in a serialized form, like magazine articles. So, you know, along come comic books, and they started with a guy named Major Wheeler Nicholson, I think in Chicago, who got the idea of taking Sunday strips from from newspapers and also the daily strips and putting them together in a magazine form. And initially, they were just those strips taken right out of the newspapers and reprinted. But then he started hiring writers and artists to come up with original ideas, and that's how Superman came about. Superman was an instant hit. Suddenly everybody, you know, young kids, foreigners trying to learn the language, you know, adults who weren't terribly literate, you know, there was a big audience for comic books at that time. And also, once World War II started, there were a lot of comic books being shipped to soldiers overseas. So at that period, you know, the comic books had probably the greatest readership they ever had. It was in that 1930s to the into the 1940s.
I have not seen the new movie yet. Some of our visitors here may have. Someone mentioned in an interview, or pardon me, a review, that the film makes allusions to Guantanamo and the Patriot Act and all kinds of, you know, obviously political points. Is that something that's newer to the age? Or back in the day, you were saying, you know, here it came up on the crest of World War II, and, you know, the Americanism was a big thing. Has it always reflected its political reality?
To a degree it has. I mean, certainly if you look at the first live-action Batman, the 1943 serial starring Lewis Wilson as Batman, that was made, went into production about a year after Pearl Harbor. And the villain in that movie is a Japanese sort of mad scientist character who's got a radium weapon. This was before the A-bomb had been detonated. So, you know, they were certainly reflecting the times then. Of course, every movie coming out of Hollywood at that period was heavily propagandistic, and the Japanese were always portrayed basically as like almost monsters, you know, inhuman. So the Batman serial just stepped right into line with that. With the later serial in 1949 and the TV show, those were a little less political, certainly. They were just more entertainments. But the Batman in the comic books was evolving and changing. So after the TV series went off the air in the 1970s, they did a revamping of Batman to make him more like, almost more of a James Bond character. Robin went off on his own. Bruce Wayne moved out of the mansion into an apartment. Everything got scaled down a little bit. But then in 1985, there was a huge development when Frank Miller published The Dark Knight Returns. And he'd been inspired to do that comic book series because of the subway shootings in New York, the Bernard Goetz subway shootings. And that got so much press nationwide, he thought, what if someone's going out there doing that every night? So that kind of inspired him to do The Dark Knight Rises, which he kind of described as Zorro meets Clint Eastwood. And that certainly had an effect on the tone of the Tim Burton movies and the Christopher Nolan movies.
I'm already hearing a lot of the names that are, you know, populate your book, and a director after director after director has gotten his hands on Batman. And, of course, different people have produced comic books through the ages, and we had the TV people who got hold of him. Is there a through line in Batman, and to a lesser extent Robin, because Robin obviously got incorporated later, is there some kind of through line where no matter who had their fingerprints all over the character or all over the production, these things have been consistently true about Batman?
Well, I think so. I mean, Batman was inspired by The Shadow, by the Douglas Fairbanks Zorro movie in 1920, by another silent film called The Bat, and a sound remake of that called The Bat Whispers. There were all these inspirations that Bob Kane and Bill Finger were drawing from. And with Zorro, you had basically a sort of foppish, rich character who would dress up in a dark outfit at night and go out to right wrongs. So that's something that's continued in just about every iteration of Batman. And also that origin story has been consistent throughout of, Batman's parents being murdered, although who the murderer is changes depending on the films. And Robin's origin story really mirrors Batman's. His parents are murdered in front of his eyes, and that's why Batman kind of took him under his wing and made him his ward.
When you talk about the origin story, I remember reading through your book and thinking, back in the day, fairy tales for kids, little kids, were bloody and horrible, and you could throw ideas out at a little kid about, oh, your mother and father murdered before your eyes. Nowadays, that would be really hard to put that out there as a product for a child. Is that too a way in which Batman is a product of his initial era?
Well, certainly. I mean, he's always going to be responding to whatever the censorship is in comic books in the particular era, and also the movies. They're targeting them to certain audiences. For instance, after the first two Tim Burton movies and the second one, Batman Returns, they had a tie-in with McDonald's. And you had all these little kids going to McDonald's, getting their Happy Meals, seeing Batman on there, and telling their parents, I want to see the Batman movie. So the parents take them off to the movies, and what they see is Danny DeVito with this really scary-looking makeup, rising up out of the muck with this black goop dripping out of his mouth. Scared the bejesus out of kids, right? So they started getting a lot of nasty letters from parents saying, come on, what's going on here? I thought this was going to be safe for my children to see. So the studio really listened to that and kind of edged Tim Burton out, brought in Joel Schumacher, and they sort of gave Schumacher the edict when they brought him in that he had to make the films kid-friendly and win back the sponsors, which is why Batman Forever and Batman and Robin are really much sillier movies than the two Tim Burton films.
Well, with all these different manipulations for different reasons, and as we'll get into later, the financial incentive to make Batman this way or another way, what about Bob Kane's influence? How far did that extend? How often did he get consulted? How much has Batman left his control?
Well, you could say Bob Kane only had a marginal control from the very beginning. I mean, I think one of the crimes of comic book history is that Batman's always credited as created by Bob Kane, but he was not the sole guy who came up with that character. He had help from Bill Finger, who he had already been working with, doing other comic stories, like, here's the Western one I can't remember the name of now. But they'd already been working on comic stories for National Periodical Publications, which became DC later on. And Bob Kane was having drinks with Ben Sullivan from National one night, and asked him about Siegel and Schuster, who were doing Superman, because it seemed like they were doing really well. And Ben Sullivan told him they were getting about $500 a week off that each, which was a lot more than Bob Kane was getting. And Kane said, well, what do you have to do to get that kind of money? And he said, well, we'd like another character like Superman. So Kane said, all right, this was on a Friday. He said, I'll have something for you on Monday. So he goes off. He starts thinking about an idea he'd had as a kid of this character with these wings based on Leonardo da Vinci's flying machine. And he called it Batman. And he took it over to Bill Finger and he said, what do you think? Now, Kane's idea was for a character wearing just a little mask, covering just part of his face, and a red outfit with these sort of stiff bat wings. And Bill Finger said, I think we can do better than that. He went to the dictionary, looked up bat. Of course, there's a picture of a bat in there. He shows it to Bob Kane, says he should look more like this. So it was Bill Finger who came up with the idea of putting him in a black and gray outfit with a cowl, and not showing the eyes, just having little white dots for the eyes, like the Phantom in the comic strips then, and giving him the scalloped cape. And also, it was Finger's idea to make him more of a detective, Sherlock Holmes type character. So had it not been for Bill Finger, Batman would be a very different character than he is now. But Finger, although he's a brilliant writer, he wasn't a very good businessman, and Kane was. So Kane had his contracts negotiated so that he would always be credited as the creator of Batman, regardless of who was drawing it or who was writing it, up until the mid-1960s. So he had a whole coterie of other writers and artists who were doing the work for him, and he was getting all the credit.
It's kind of grim.
Well, it is. I mean, there's a lot of grimness that goes with Batman. I mean, in his true origin story, how he himself as a character was created, in the comic books, how he becomes Batman. The villains he faces are sometimes, people who have been disfigured or maimed in some way, like the Joker or Two-Face. So, there's a lot of grimness in Batman. It's kind of a running theme.
What about Batman's limitations in being primarily a damaged human being? He's not from another planet. He doesn't, turn invisible and slink from room to room. I mean, it's got to be kind of hard to write around when Superman's flying around and the Green Hornet is off doing his thing.
I think actually it's a little bit of the opposite. A lot of writers say they have a hard time writing for Superman because he's so invincible, right? So every so often they start, it's kind of a ramping back his powers, making him a little weaker, so it's easier to write stories of having him opposing things he can't instantly overcome. With Batman, he does have those physical limitations, although he's, developed his body to perfection, and he's a scientific genius and a great detective and all this sort of stuff. But most of the writers who approach Batman say that, his greatest asset is his wealth. That's his secret weapon. That he's got all this wealth he can use to make all these gadgets and have that Batmobile.
I think I'm not giving anything away if I say that the question of Bruce Wayne's wealth figures into the new movie. So in that way, it's reflecting the world around him as well. It
does, yeah. It kind of ties into the movements that are going on now. The sort of what do you call it? Gosh, I just blanked on the name of them. But all the sort of anti-wealth movements, the populist movements that are happening right now, certainly plays a part in the new film.
In fact, there were some comparisons made to Zuccotti Park with Occupy, but this was actually written 13 months before Zuccotti Park, so some of those hold up and some of those don't, some of the comparisons. I want to remind our audience, if you have any questions as we go along or anything you'd like to contribute, just write it down on some of the paper near your seat, and Leslie will grab those when you hold them up, and she'll get them over to me here, and we can incorporate those into the conversation. Let's talk about some of the characters. We already hit on Robin a little bit. Let's talk about his genesis, and from a dramatic point of view, what was the point of Robin? Why did they bring him in, and how has he evolved?
The basic reason they brought Robin in was because Batman needed someone to talk to. When he's out solving crime, he's either going to have a lot of thought balloons or be saying a lot of stuff out loud that he wouldn't, or you give him a sidekick to talk to. And Robin also kind of served the purpose of either being someone who can get in jeopardy and Batman has to rescue him, or if Batman's in jeopardy, he can come to the rescue. But he was introduced in 1940 after Batman had been solo for a year, and the comics really began to leap in popularity after Robin came on the scene. And that had a huge impact on all the other comic book heroes. Suddenly, any comic book hero that came out had the youthful sidekick. So you had Captain America and Bucky, the Flash and Speedy, and on and on and on.
So how about how he has evolved as a character? We see that's his main point, but we saw him in the TV series. He had all the punchlines, holy guacamole, Batman, and he was almost a comic foil, and obviously not now.
Yeah, that holy whatever thing was something that Lorenzo Semple, who was one of the co-creators of the TV series, brought to the character. In the comics, he'd always been kind of like maybe 12 to 14 years old, and that's how he was portrayed in the first serial. And you can kind of see why, as they get into the later serial and the TV series, they might have wanted Robin more like a 19, 20-year-old. Because when you watch that first serial, it's a little disconcerting to see, what looks like a little kid getting punched around by grown men. So in the later versions, they always make Robin more of an adult. And of course, in the comic books, Robin eventually left Bruce Wayne, went off to college, took on an identity called Nightwing, and there are other characters in who Bruce Wayne took under his wing and adopted as Robin.
Michael Caine as Alfred is almost paternal. Did Alfred always have those characteristics?
I think so. Certainly there's some of that in the TV series and in the comics as well. It's kind of an interesting thing with Alfred. When he was first introduced, he was a very rotund, short, rotund, almost a parody of a British butler who loved reading mystery novels. And when they were making that first serial in 1943, they cast an actor to play Alfred who was very tall and lean and thin. So the comic book publishers decided they needed to make their comic books reflect the movie a little more. So in the comics, they had Alfred go away to a health spa and come back lean and trim to match William Austin in the serial. But he's pretty much always been, Bruce's sort of paternal figure, father confessor, however you want to look at it. It kind of serves the same purpose in some ways as M does in the James Bond movies.
Commissioner Gordon, in addition to whatever purposes he serves as an individual, as the face of authority, he conveys to some extent that Batman, whatever his inner turmoils might be, whatever his demons might be, is pretty much an okay guy. He's usually on the side of established authority.
Yeah, Commissioner Gordon, and certainly in the more recent versions of Batman, he's the guy who understands that he can only go so far because he's limited by the laws, by what's legal to do. Batman can kind of step outside the law a little bit. In the TV show, they were always very careful to sort of announce that Batman was a fully deputized law enforcement officer. So they had Batman not so much stepping outside the bounds of legal propriety. But in the newer films, Batman's more of like a dark vigilante character.
Does that make him anti-police or anti the powers that be? I mean, how much has that twisted for him?
No, he's still on the side of law and order and sort of upholds the police. I mean, in the Dark Knight, at the end of that movie, he's basically sacrificing himself and setting himself up to be the person that the police are going to be chasing, so that Harvey Dent can remain blameless. But he's doing that to sort of protect authority, to protect law and order.
When did the first significant female character show up, either in the comic books or in the TV, in the movies?
In 1940, within the first year of Batman, you had the first appearance of Catwoman, and from the very beginning, when they introduced her in the comic books, you had Batman having this, romantic feelings for her. So that's something that was established from the very beginning with her. By the end of the 1950s, there was a character, Batwoman, there was a Batgirl. So there were, the Batman family had expanded quite a bit. And then in the early 1960s, when they decided to do away with all that and revamp it, they got rid of Batwoman. Eventually, for the TV show, they wanted to reintroduce Batgirl, so they did that as Commissioner Gordon's daughter. So that tied in with something the TV producers wanted, and they echoed it in the comic books. And she later became a character called Oracle in the comics after being shot by the Joker.
How, of all the female characters, which ones do you think are fully realized? We know, let me back that up by saying, we know Batman so well at this point. We can talk about him as a person, his failures, his dreams, what he aspires to, what he's given up. Are there any of the women characters who are that fleshed out?
In the comic books, there's quite a few, like Talia al Ghul, who's the daughter of Ra's al Ghul, who has a romantic relationship with Batman in the comics in the 70s and 80s. In the more current films, in Batman Returns, I think the character of Catwoman was very well fleshed out. As a matter of fact, Michael Keaton was complaining that Tim Burton spent so much time on the Penguin's origin and Catwoman's origin that he was like a guest star in his own movie. And in the current film also, I think we get a good sense of who the Catwoman is and why she's doing what she's doing, and some of the other characters as well. So, I do think they at least make some kind of effort to flesh these characters out in the more recent films.
To the original comics, as we kind of run down the enemies here, the enemies list. In the original comic series, who was the first enemy to show up that had staying power, that showed up in more than two comics?
I think that would be the Joker, right? And the Joker was someone who was developed when Jerry Robertson, who was working with Bill Finger and Bob Kane at that point, came in one day with a playing card and said, what if we do a character like this? Had the Joker playing card. And Bill Finger thought, well, that's an interesting idea. Let's see how we can develop that. And he always kept the file of photos and newspaper clippings and so on that he would draw on for his stories. And he thumbed through there and found a picture of Conrad Veidt from a movie called The Man Who Laughs, a silent film, and said, maybe we should make him look kind of like this. And they did. If you look at the drawings of the Joker in the early comics, they're almost identical to the still photos of Conrad Veidt from that film. But the Joker, in his initial introduction was a really nasty piece of work, kind of. Actually, the plot line of that first Joker story borrows quite a bit from The Bat Whispers, the remake of The Bat. It's 1930 sound film. But he was the first character who really had staying power and caught on. And then later came the Penguin. The Riddler, not so much. He really gained popularity more with the TV show than with the comic books. And of course, Catwoman had always been a popular character in the comic books and also in the TV show. But the TV show began creating their own characters like King Tut and Bookworm and so on. So they kind of had a mix of classic characters from the comics plus ones they were creating for the TV show.
How far did the comic book creators feel compelled to justify the appearance and the costumes and the weird facial stuff going on with the villains? Were there backstories provided, or was it just a given?
It was just a given early on. Later on in the comics, sometimes they would come up with origin stories for these villains, but a lot of times when they first appeared on the scene, they were just, quirky characters, certain sort of physical characteristics, or, they'd have some psychological thing they fixated on, like the penny plunderer, whose crimes all involve pennies, There's no real explanation given for how he became that way, so...
Maybe that's a measure of the irony of our age. I mean, maybe a modern day, if he were just born now, Robin must spend a lot of time looking at the enemies and going, "Hey, what's up with your face? Why do you look like that?" But now they're established. Mm-hmm. Did that change as the movies came into more prominence? Because we have a more modern, perhaps more skeptical audience? Was there more justification to fill in backstory?
Well, I think the scriptwriters always felt a kind of an obligation to. With the 1989 Batman, we get both Batman's origin and the Joker's. With Batman Returns, we get the origins of Catwoman and Penguin, and then with the next movie, we see the origin of Two-Face and Robin and the Riddler. So, and they're not always conforming to the way they were in the comic books, so they do take some liberties with them, So that kind of continues with all the films. I feel like if they're introducing the villain, they have to kind of tell you what the origin is. Until, that is, you get to The Dark Knight, where the director of that one felt like, Chris Nolan felt like it would be more of an elemental evil if the Joker just kind of shows up. So you get the first shot of the movie, Joker on the street corner, and he just starts doing what he's doing, and we never really know what his backstory is, because he gives us several little versions of it as the film progresses.
I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and ask about the casting of the Joker again, because Heath Ledger made such an impact, and then his own death was so tragic that I think there's an association they really had to fight there. How did they deal with that?
Well, of course, when they were casting the Joker, they had to kind of get over the Jack Nicholson image as well, because he'd made such an indelible image as the Joker. But Nolan had been impressed with Heath Ledger's performance in Brokeback Mountain and wanted him to come in for a reading, read him, thought he was great. Ledger kind of based it on a British punk rocker, his performance. But, it was such a... I think there was a misconception. Right after he died, everyone was saying, oh gosh, he couldn't shake that role and was, that's what killed him. But that's not really the truth. I mean, he'd finished filming almost a year before the film came out, and was already working on the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. So, it was just, he was taking drugs to keep himself awake, drugs to make him go to sleep, and he just accidentally overdosed. I think that's what happened. But there were people who talked to him and said that no, he wasn't depressed. He didn't mean to take his life. It was just an accident. But I think, since that happened just before the film was released, it kind of colored people's perceptions of, his performance and the impact the movie had on him.
That illustrates what every new director coming in has to somehow acknowledge the past. A Jack Nicholson performance or a Heath Ledger, you can't throw it out entirely. On the other hand, you have to create that character anew. You have to bring in an actor who's somehow capable of integrating bits of that and yet making it their own.
Yeah, and I think certainly with the movies made in the 80s and 90s, they were trying to cast actors whose personas were already kind of in line with the character they were playing. Because frankly, if you ask me, although I think Nicholson's great as the Joker, it's not that much different than him playing the devil in The Witches of Eastwick. It's just Jack on overdrive, Then later on you get, DeVito as the Penguin, who, is not terribly dissimilar from his Louis De Palma persona in Taxi. Although Michelle Pfeiffer did a great job as Catwoman, that was kind of out of her realm of the sort of role she'd been playing, being so overtly sexual. But then you get, for instance, Jim Carrey playing the Riddler. I mean, that's basically just Jim Carrey in a green outfit, doing his Jim Carrey shtick. Or Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze, he's doing that outsized Arnold sort of persona with a lot of bad puns. So, they're already kind of building on the personas these actors bring to these roles.
It almost seems as though the Batman films that you were just referring to, the modern ones, but not the ones we've come up to now, they almost had more of a sense of self-awareness and a bit more ability to laugh at themselves. Is that accurate?
I think so. I mean, the one thing that I personally don't like as much about the Nolan films, and I think they're brilliant movies, but there's really not much of a sense of humor to them at all. I think if you look at the earlier films, you think, well, those are movies based on comic books, and they're emphasizing the comic, and Nolan seems to be taking it more from the graphic novels. His films are more graphic. They put the emphasis on the graphic. But, certainly the Burton movies have Tim Burton himself has such a skewed sense of humor that he works into all his movies, and it's unmistakably there in Batman. And as I say, with the Joel Schumacher movies, he was under the edict from Warner Brothers. He had to make his films kid-friendly, so there's a much more overt sense of humor in those films.
Let's talk about Tim Burton's inspiration to take on Michael Keaton. You write in your book about all the dropped jaws when they looked at, Beetlejuice or Mr. Mom and said, "This is Batman?"
Yeah, I mean, Michael Uslan, who's been the producer of all those Batman films from the 1989 Batman to The Dark Knight Rises, he's the guy who really had the inspiration to make a serious Batman movie and went about acquiring the rights and getting the scripts written and getting it produced. Of course, he acquired the rights in 1979, 1980 and thought it would be a slam dunk. Studios would line up to get this character, and he found out it took him 10 years to convince him that, no, this isn't the Adam West silly guy in a costume. This is a serious Batman. But in casting that, he wanted to go for someone more like an Alec Baldwin, who was just starting his career at that time, very handsome, square-jawed actor. Burton eventually convinced him that, a square jaw does not a Batman make. Burton's conception was that he's more of an everyman who becomes Batman when he puts on this outfit, this sort of armored outfit. And having worked with Keaton on Beetlejuice, he knew Keaton had an explosive temper. He thought that would work kind of well in the Batman persona if he toned Keaton down and got more of that energy coming out of him. And he felt that in order for someone to dress up like that and go out and fight crime, they had to be a little nuts. They had to be a little crazy. And he said when you look in Michael Keaton's eyes, you can see a little bit of that. That he's got that energy in his eyes, that he could snap at any moment.
Yeah, and you pointed out that the energy in the eyes matters as it would with any character, but especially when you're going to stick a mask over the rest of the face. It's got to be in the eyes.
Right. I mean, it's all in the eyes and the mouth. That's all you can see of that character. And of course, Val Kilmer had those marvelous sort of Cupid's bow lips. As far as just being the most physically correct, I think, for the role personally, I think George Clooney was the one who looked most like the Batman of the comics. That was a very good choice for the role. He just had the misfortune of being in a really bad movie.
Let's talk about the physical evolution of Batman. I mean, he's gone from looking more like an everyman, a guy who maybe is a little more buff than usual, to a guy who's juicing. We're looking at a guy who's obviously taking something to get muscles that big. What's the through line there? Did he start out big? Did he go small? Did he get bigger?
Well, if you're talking about the comic books, I mean, it's just the conventions of how superhero characters are drawn in those eras, where in the beginnings they were drawing them based on what were circus muscle men and so on, the Charles Atlas types. But, as those guys start juicing and using steroids and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the comics kind of change to reflect that as well with the superheroes. But, I mean, if the movies followed that to a T, it would be really tough for, say, a very hyper-muscular Superman to be able to hide himself in a Clark Kent disguise,
There's a picture in your book of Michael Keaton facing off with, I believe it's the Joker, and
Right.
it really strikes home that the physical attributes of that character, of that Batman, that version, are not overwhelming. That
No, he was not a. He's about 5'10", I think, Michael Keaton. So he was about the same height as Jack Nicholson. So he's not a character who's going to tower over the villains or be imposing or what have you. So it wasn't until actually I think probably not till Christian Bale do you get a Batman who's really over 6 feet. I think Clooney and Kilmer are both a little under 6 feet themselves. So.
What's your thought? What are your thoughts on Christian Bale as Batman?
I think he's very good. I mean, he's a fabulous actor, and when he went into doing Batman Begins, Christopher Nolan's idea for that movie was he wanted to do a movie that wasn't just about Batman, where you're just sitting through the Bruce Wayne parts, bored to death, waiting for Batman to show up. He wanted you to care as much about Bruce Wayne as you did about Batman. And I think Christian Bale carries that off very well in the films. He makes you feel a lot of empathy for Bruce Wayne, even when he's not in the outfit.
Well, we really haven't talked about Bruce Wayne as almost a separate entity than Batman. Bruce Wayne is Batman, and Batman is Bruce Wayne. But how has he been developed as a character, first in the comic books and then as in the movies?
Well, as I say, in the comic books, he was really based on sort of the idea of Zorro, the sort of foppish playboy who dresses up as a hero at night. So in the early comics, I think it was more of a case of he's Bruce Wayne and Batman is the persona he adapts to fight crime. Once you get to The Dark Knight Returns in 1985, from that point onward, there's kind of a switch in the psychology of how the character is portrayed in both the comic books and the films, where it's more of, seeing his parents murdered before his eyes scarred him so much that he is really Batman. That's who he is. And Bruce Wayne is the disguise he adopts to interact with the rest of society in the normal world.
There's a reviewer from Forbes magazine who was talking about the current incarnation of Batman, and they say that it comes down to who was Batman. He was just Batman. The person under the mask doesn't matter. That Bruce Wayne is almost an afterthought at this point. That it's the mask and the cape and your drive for justice that transform you into Batman. How does that sit with you?
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, certainly with any character, archetypal character like this, you're going to have certain character attributes. I mean, you look at anyone wearing a deerstalker cap and an Inverness cape and a pipe, and you think Sherlock Holmes, or any actor, regardless of how they look, once they put on a tuxedo and a shaken not stirred martini and a Walther PPK, it's James Bond. So certainly there's a lot to these characters where the character comes, as much from the exterior, what's cloaking them, as from within.
It's fascinating that the front page of your book is the dollar sign. And of course, it's called $1 Billion Batman. So let's start talking about Batman as an asset and a cash producer, a cash cow. There's no naivete about the fact that it was born as a commercial enterprise. Comic books were made to make money. Has it ever been any different? I mean, now he's making money on the big screen and a lot more money. But is there some sort of delusion that it's been overtaken by the cash?
Oh, I don't think so. I think comic books have always been profit-driven. I mean, they were. There's a very fascinating book. I think it's called Men of Tomorrow. It's all about the birth of the comic book industry by Gerard Jones. Fascinating book. If you haven't read it, you should. If you're interested in comics, but it really talks about how these. It was basically a lot of Jewish businessmen who weren't really welcomed in any other circles. Kind of developed this whole comic book industry. Some of them came from rather shady backgrounds, as bookies and running prostitution rings and so on. But comic books were very profitable from the get-go. And actually, Batman as a character after the 1950s, his popularity was really starting to wane. So much so that they were just about to cancel the Batman comic book in 1965, 1966. But then, once the Batman TV show came on, suddenly it shot back up to the top of the sales charts, and they were selling all sorts of merchandising related to the TV show. So overnight it became a huge hit all over again. And with the Tim Burton movies from that point on, those have been very heavily merchandised. I mean, Jack Nicholson, part of his agreement for playing the Joker was that he would get a cut of the merchandising profits, And as a result of that, he ended up making $60 million off of Batman. So, it certainly is a money-making machine. So much so that when Warner Brothers went to Joel Schumacher to ask him to direct it, the way they approached him was they said, how would you like to be in charge of our biggest corporate asset? That's how they view it. It is their biggest corporate asset still. And they've got Harry Potter, so that says something, But,
well, you already talked about how they had to tone down some of the violence in the wake of what happened with the McDonald's figures in that franchise. Are there any less overt ways that the front office has stepped in and said, here's what you need to do to tweak the content or tweak the character out of financial concerns?
I don't think so. Not so much with the Christopher Nolan movies, because they certainly seem to have a lot of faith in how, quite honestly, it was because of a lot of front office interference that Batman and Robin was the horrible movie that it was. So I think after that, Warner's kind of learned their lesson, and the executives have backed off a little bit and given the filmmakers a little more leeway to create their vision of Batman. And the Christopher Nolan Batman, it doesn't totally conform to the comic books, but it's a version of Batman that audiences certainly respond to. And again, one of the reasons the book is called $1 Billion Batman is because the previous film, The Dark Knight, earned over $1 billion at the box office. The current film, worldwide, has already earned over $500 million and is well on its way to earning $1 billion by the time it ends its run.
Question from the audience. Can you talk a little bit about how the comics and animated series showed Batman as the world's greatest detective, something you alluded to, but then the movies didn't do that? Did that become part of the conversation around the movies at all, to go back to his detective roots, or did they consciously discard that?
I'm not sure how much of it is being consciously discarded. Certainly the animated series is, sort of follows that wonderfully, and shows that wonderfully, more so than the feature films had. I really love the animated series. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough page space to cover it in the book, or it would have been like a Tolstoy novel, so I had to just focus on the live-action ones. But yeah, the live-action films, I think by the time they've spent a lot of time explaining who the characters are and where the villains come from and so on, there's just not a whole lot of screen time left to get into a lot of detective work. And also, the detective work in movies tends to be kind of slow and methodical and tedious, and when audiences come to something like a Batman film, they want to see a lot of action.
Having a little breakup on the screen, I want to make sure the audience was able to understand that last comment. Yes, okay, good. But you're coming back, it looks like. So, talk about the way that the creators, and be it of a film or of the comic books, this applies in almost any comic book, be it Superman or whomever, you have to be able to put your hero in danger. But it's pretty clear to the audience that with the financial, if this is a cash cow, I want to make sure we didn't just lose you. Do we still have you?
I'm here, yeah.
Okay, good. You can't put him in enough danger that he's really going to die. So how do the comic book writers and the movie writers deal with making it seem so edge of your chair, and yet they make sure he's back for the next franchise?
Well, that's just the art of writing in general. I mean, with any movie you go to, whether it's a James Bond film or practically any film, you know the stars are usually going to be alive at the end of the movie. So it's part of the skill of the writer to be able to take you just about as far down as you possibly can with that character and put them in as much jeopardy as you can without killing them, and then have them in the very end bounce back and recover. So that's it's just kind of basic screenwriting.
You talked about in the 1950s how Batman was starting to slide in popularity. Do you know if it was considered to just kill the franchise, move on to something new and fresh?
Well, as I say, in the around 1964-65, they were seriously thinking of killing the Batman comic book. They were just going to stop publication. I don't think they would have killed the character off. They would have just stopped publishing it because of a lack of sales.
That'd be real. If I were a comic book fan, if I were a Batman fan, I guess I would expect more of that. If you're going to just take him away after at that point, 20 years, tell me why. That's a comic book convention? They just stop?
Well, sometimes. I mean, sometimes there are reasons, financial reasons and so on, why the plug gets pulled on these things, so they don't really have time to write a story that ties it all together. It happens with TV shows, too, like the Lois and Clark TV series ended on a cliffhanger that was never resolved because the show got canceled,
Let's talk about the costuming through the years? And, you talked a bit about how the very first manifestation from Bob Kane really didn't work, and then Finger got involved and it got better. What about the costuming through the years, first as reflected in the TV show, where they really did look like walking comic book characters, to what they've done in the movies throughout since then?
Yeah, in the comic books, after the first year, they pretty well standardized Batman's outfit, and he started off in a black and gray outfit. It was black with sort of blue highlights, which is a sort of comic book standard. But over the years, that kind of got converted into being just a blue and gray outfit. It's kind of black shadows. But throughout the 40s and 50s, it was an outfit that just had a black bat on the chest with no yellow oval. But when they revamped the character in the early 1960s, that was one of the things they did as part of the new look Batman, was to put a yellow oval around the bat and sort of standardize the outfit a little more. And that's the costume that shows up in the TV series. Although it's interesting to note, when they made the pilot for the TV series, which you can still see on, the screen test for the TV series, and you can still find these on YouTube. You can see Adam West wearing a Batman outfit that just has the black bat with no yellow circle. But once they get to the films, the costume designers, I guess, are trying to come up with a way to design an outfit that's going to look good on screen that people won't laugh at, right? So I think it was Tim Burton's idea to go with the whole totally black Batman costume, except they did have the yellow bat initially. And over the movies, that kind of evolved into just being, this kind of bat shape on the outfit without the yellow oval. But, I think with Tim Burton, too, it was the idea that you got this everyman, and he needs some kind of armor to protect him from bullets and, getting hit with a pipe and so on and so forth.
Really interesting question from one of our audience members. What about the name itself, Bruce Wayne? Is his name a hint at his character? And I'll read you this in full. The connections with his two sides battling each other, one becomes stronger while the other wanes, like the phases of the moon. And are there other names that hint of that kind of interest throughout the series?
That's a very interesting analysis of that name. Now, Bob Kane says he chose Bruce Wayne just because it sounded like Bob Kane.
Oh.
He also says it sort of harkens back to Robert the Bruce of Scotland and Mad Anthony Wayne, a Revolutionary War general. So, those are kind of his sources for the name. But yeah, I don't think they were conscious of. I mean, basically, you're talking about 19 to 21-year-old kids developing this character who were not college educated. So, I don't think they were that aware of trying to come up with names that were going to be sort of symbolic.
One of our audience members wants to know how the fighting style of Batman has evolved over time. In the animated series, as opposed to the Dark Knight trilogy, is he stiffer? Is he more agile? How has that evolved?
Well, again, I can't really speak too much to the animated series because I love them, but I haven't seen all of them. And in the movies, of course, in the TV show, you get all the pow and whap and bam and all that stuff, which were basically there to hide how far they were missing each other when they threw punches. So it allowed them to get away with some pretty sloppy stunt work, saved them a lot of shooting time. When you get to the movies, they were trying to incorporate some more kind of martial arts into the fighting, and I think in Batman Forever they had some martial artists in some of the scenes wearing the Batman outfit, doing some of the moves and leaps and what have you. And in the Christopher Nolan movies, there's a particular martial arts fighting style, I think called Kenji or something like that, that they developed just because it's a very quick, brutal, it's not about just protecting yourself, it's about, breaking the bones of your opponent so he can't keep attacking you. So they adapted that for Batman.
We only briefly brushed up against the animated series there, and I know you said that the reason it's not in your book, I mean, everything else is in the book. It's a huge and thorough book. In fact, Publishers Weekly called this near obsessive, which I thought was fun. But you mentioned that you didn't include the animated series because it's just a big book and something had to go. Why was it the animated series that had to go? What was it, lesser impact, lesser import?
Well, I love movies. I like, live action films, and just wanted to kind of focus on that. And also in the live action films, you can really follow the character from the 40s up through the modern day. With the animated series, they didn't start doing an animated Batman until 1967, when I think it was Filmation did the first one. And then he reappears as part of the Super Friends in the 70s and 80s, and then you jump to 1992, I think it is, when they did Batman Returns, that they started the Batman the Animated Series, which has run in some form as either that or, oh gosh, I forget what they call it now, the Batman in the Future sort of show. So, it's been running now for well over 20 years, I guess.
I'm a movie fan as well as you are. And when I read in the book, I thought I knew everything about Bette Davis. I didn't know that one of her husbands, Gary Merrill, had actually voiced Batman on the radio, so that was fun to find out. And I wonder, you already brought a huge amount of knowledge to this. Was there anything in researching the book and put it together where you thought, okay, that's really cool? That was my response to the Bette Davis bit. What made you say, wow, I didn't know that, that's neat?
Yeah, there's quite a bit that I found out in writing it. All the books I'd read, all the research I'd done, always said that Matt Crowley was radio's Batman, and Batman never had his own show, but he showed up frequently on the Superman show. They did try a couple of pilots that never took off for Batman. But when I went back and re-listened to all those old Superman shows, it was very clear that it wasn't just Matt Crowley. I mean, there was also Stacey Harris who did some of them, but clearly the one who voiced Batman most often was Gary Merrill, who later on married Bette Davis. So Bette Davis was married to Batman. One of the other things I didn't realize was the impact that the serial had in 1943. It's from the serial, not only does that sort of give us the skinnier Alfred, but it's the serial that gave us the Batcave. Because up to that point in the comic books and the newspaper strips, Bruce Wayne just had kind of a big garage underneath the mansion where he had the Batmobile and all his equipment. But when the writers of the serial were coming up with a story, they thought, well, he's a bat, let's put him in a cave. Bob Kane's out in Hollywood watching them shoot this, sees this cave set and thinks, that's a great idea, why didn't we think of that? Calls up Bill Finger, tells Bill Finger, and Bill Finger's like, that's a great idea, why didn't we think of it? So from that point on, in the comics, Batman has a Batcave that becomes more than just a place for him to have his weapons. It becomes almost like a museum for Batman to have reminders of all the cases he solved.
What about some of the other iconic bits? When did the bat signal come about?
I think that it was clearly in the comic books. You see it also in the second Batman serial. You don't see it in the first. The first serial, as much as it was using, things from the comic books and inspired things in the comic books, still there was a lot that it deleted as well. There's no Commissioner Gordon in the first serial. There's a police captain named Captain Arnold. So it did change things around. There's also no Batmobile in either serial because the budgets wouldn't allow for that. So you just have Batman driving them around in, just basic cars. I think it's a convertible in the first one, and Batman and Robin change clothes in the back seat. So so there are a few things that change as they go along.
Am I missing any of the icons that we should account for? We got the Bat Signal, we got the Batmobile, we have the Batcave.
Oh, I'm sure there are a ton of them, but some of the audience members may think of more they want to hear about. So.
Okay. Let me see. We have a question here as well. Oh, no, we've got that one covered. So let's talk a little bit about your own interest in Batman. And everyone here obviously is interested, and there are audiences across the country who pile in all the time. You've taken it the extra mile to write this incredibly comprehensive book. What is Batman's appeal for you?
Well, I think my Batman's appeal for me began when I was about 5 years old and I turned on the TV and see the Adam West TV show. I was just the right age for that show when it hit the air, so that made me a Batman fan at a very early age. And as I got older, I started reading the comic books and just kind of kept up with it. I saw all the movies as they came out. I was actually at the premiere of the 1989 Batman. Me and a friend decided we would crash that. I was living in LA at the time. Also was at a press screening of Batman and Robin where, the film starts, they show the bat signal on the screen, the audience is hooping and hollering like, yay, it's Batman, woo! And about 20 minutes into the movie, people start getting up and walking out, and, before the movie's over, the theater's half empty. So I think if there were any Warner's execs in the audience that night, they already knew they had a stinker on their hands. But, I've just been a Batman fan for a long time, and as I say, I love movies, and I really love doing research on movies. And if you're going to do all this research, might as well do something with it. So.
Cool job. Got a last question for you that comes from one of our audience members. Since Batman has survived 80 years, do you think he'll continue to evolve and celebrate the 100th birthday of his creation? Is anything already in the works for that?
Not that I'm aware of, but although Christopher Nolan says he wants this movie to be his last Batman, I'm sure it will not be the last Batman movie because, as I say, it's a huge money-making property, and they've really, with the more recent film, kind of set a platform that the next director or the next filmmakers can start with to create their own Batman saga if they choose to. Of course, they could also totally reinvent it the way they have with Spider-Man. But I'm sure that, as long as these movies are making money, there will always be Batman movies.
It's been a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Thank you for coming in, Bruce Scivally.
Thank you.
And don't forget to keep checking in on our website to find some other series that are coming up, or events in the series coming up. And again, we're always open to your suggestions about the series as well. So submit any ideas that you have. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.